Welcome. If you've chosen to listen to this audiobook, it means you're curious about something deeper. Maybe you feel stuck, frustrated by recurring setbacks, or you sense that something inside you keeps getting in the way of your progress, your relationships, or your peace of mind. You've likely heard people talk about ego in casual conversation. Someone has a big ego. Ego gets in the way. Ego needs to be checked. But in everyday speech, the word is thrown around so loosely that its deeper psychological meaning can be lost. What if I told you that understanding ego, not as a buzzword but as a core part of how your mind operates, could be one of the most transformative insights you ever gain? In psychology, the term ego has a specific foundational role. It originates from early theories of the human psyche, particularly those introduced by Sigmund Freud, where the ego is one of the three main components of personality. The ego serves as the rational mediator between our instinctual urges, our moral or idealistic standards, and the reality we live in. It's the part of our mind that helps us make sense of the world, make decisions, and balance internal desires with external expectations. But the idea of ego extends far beyond a clinical definition. At its heart, ego is the lens through which you interpret yourself and your experiences. It's the voice that tells you who you are and what you think you should be. It's the part of your inner world that seeks validation, that faces fear when challenged, and that clings to identity, roles, and stories you've built over years. In everyday life, this same ego that keeps you grounded can also, when left unconscious or unexamined, quietly sabotage your growth. Sometimes it does this not through dramatic outbursts, but through patterns of avoidance, comparison, defensiveness, or fear of change that shows up in daily decisions and interactions. This audiobook, Ego is Killing You, is not here to teach you that having an ego is inherently bad. In fact, a healthy ego supports your ability to function effectively in the world. A healthy sense of self helps you regulate emotions, adapt to your environment, and make thoughtful decisions instead of acting purely on impulse. It provides a foundation for confidence and resilience, enabling you to face challenges without being overwhelmed by them. Yet, when the ego becomes overly rigid, inflated, or reactionary, it can distort the way you perceive yourself and others. It can magnify fear of failure and make you afraid to take risks. It can make criticism feel like a personal attack, turn feedback into defense, and cause your self-worth to become tied to external validation rather than inner values. An unchecked ego can lead to unhelpful comparisons, unnecessary conflict, and a deep sense of disconnection, not just from other people, but even from your own genuine desires. In this audiobook, we will explore how ego can subtly influence your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, often without you even realizing it. We'll talk about where ego comes from, how it forms and strengthens, and how it can shift from being a protective part of your psychological makeup to something that limits your potential. You'll begin to understand how ego impacts not just your internal world, but your relationships and choices in life. We won't stop at understanding. We'll move into practical and insightful territory. How to notice ego in your everyday thoughts and decisions. How to distinguish between ego-driven habits and authentic intentions. And ultimately, how to work with the ego so that it stops directing your life from behind the scenes. This is about increasing awareness, not annihilation of your sense of self. You will learn to differentiate a healthy ego, one that helps you navigate reality, from an egocentric self that clings to fear, validation, and separation. In the chapters ahead, we will cover Chapter 2, What Ego Really Is, defining the ego as a psychological construct and exploring how identity and self-image are formed. Chapter 3, The Silent Saboteur, how ego holds you back without you noticing, shaping your reactions and responses. Chapter 4, How Ego Affects Your Life, the real-world consequences ego has on relationships and fulfillment. Chapter 5, recognizing ego patterns, how to recognize your own ego triggers and habits. Chapter 6, Transcending Ego, Tools and Mindset Shifts to Loosen Ego's Grip. Chapter 7, Living with Ego Wisely, Integrating Awareness and Direction so you're not controlled by ego, but guided by intention. Chapter 8, Your Path Forward, a summary of insights and a hopeful path toward authentic living beyond ego's limitations. So let this chapter be a beginning, not just intellectually, but emotionally and spiritually. Let it be a moment of curiosity and courage, where you stop seeing ego as an abstract concept and begin to notice it as a living influence in your decisions, your fears, and your aspirations. As we embark on this journey together, remember that understanding ego is not about defeating a part of yourself. It's about reclaiming your attention, your authenticity, and your capacity to live with open awareness and genuine purpose.
Chapter 2. What Ego Really Is. When we hear the word ego, many of us immediately imagine someone who is arrogant, self-centered, or overly confident, someone with a big ego. But that everyday usage only scratches the surface of what ego really means in psychological terms. To truly understand how ego influences your thoughts, emotions, and behavior, we need to move beyond stereotypes and explore how it functions as a central part of your inner world, sometimes in ways you barely notice. In psychology, the ego is best understood as the part of your personality that helps you stay grounded, make wise choices, and manage your emotions in a constantly changing world. It's not a villain lurking behind every choice you make. In fact, it plays an essential role in how you interact with reality. According to psychological theory rooted in the work of Sigmund Freud, the human mind is made up of three interacting systems: the id, which seeks immediate gratification of instinctual urges; the superego, which represents moral values and societal standards; and the ego, which mediates between these internal forces and external world. The ego operates according to something called the reality principle, guiding you to make decisions that satisfy your needs in ways that are realistic, socially acceptable, and grounded in context. At its best, the ego helps you distinguish between your inner desires and what is actually possible or appropriate in a given situation. For example, imagine you're hungry while sitting in a long meeting. The primal id may push you to jump up and seek food immediately. The superego may demand perfect propriety and insist you never show discomfort. The ego stands in the middle and helps you weigh both. Maybe wait until the meeting ends, maybe distract yourself with productive thinking, a rational solution that satisfies internal needs without disrupting external reality. But the ego is more than a neutral decision maker. It's also the lens through which you construct your sense of self, your identity, your I and me narrative. The ego helps you create a coherent sense of who you are, incorporating memories, values, and social feedback into a story that feels continuous and stable. When this self-narrative is healthy, you feel confident, clear, and flexible. You can adapt and learn from experience. However, the ego can also expand beyond its useful role and start operating like a defensive agent, a psychological shield that protects your self-image from discomfort, insecurity, or threat. In these moments, the ego shifts from helping you navigate reality to preserving a particular version of yourself, one that feels safe, justified, or superior. This kind of ego isn't just confidence, it's reactive self-importance, a need to guard a particular identity or narrative against anything that feels threatening. In everyday life, this defensive ego shows up in subtle yet powerful ways. Defensiveness is one of the most common examples. When someone offers feedback, even gentle feedback, and your immediate reaction is to reject, justify, or explain rather than listen, you're witnessing the ego in action. It's not simply wanting reassurance, it's the ego protecting itself from the possibility that you could be wrong or imperfect. Similarly, comparison, the habit of measuring yourself against others, of needing to feel better than or ahead of, is another expression of ego at work, crafting a sense of worth based on external metrics instead of inner reality. Another everyday ego pattern is resisting criticism. When you find it almost unbearable to hear that you might have made a mistake, it's often not merely pride. It's the ego holding tightly to an identity that must appear competent or justified. This can lead to blame, deflection, rationalization, or even projection, where you attribute your own discomfort or shortcomings to someone else instead of acknowledging them in yourself. These behaviors are not random. They are ego defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect itself from anxiety, conflict, or perceived threat. It's important to remember that these ego responses aren't inherently bad. They serve a psychological purpose, stabilizing your sense of self, reducing emotional discomfort, and helping you cope in challenging moments. Defense mechanisms such as denial, projection, or rationalization often arise when the ego feels threatened by thoughts or feelings it doesn't want to face directly. But when these patterns become the default way you deal with life's challenges, they can distort your view of reality, dampen your capacity for introspection, and keep you locked in unhelpful cycles of thought and behavior. As you begin to see ego not just as a big personality trait or a judgment, but as a psychological process that operates constantly within you, you gain insight into why you feel the way you do in moments of stress, conflict, or comparison. You also begin to understand that the goal isn't to eliminate ego, that's neither possible nor desirable, but to notice when it is operating out of balance and to cultivate a more flexible, responsive way of being. This awareness is the first step towards recognizing ego patterns in yourself, which we will explore more deeply in the chapters ahead.
Chapter 3: The Silent Saboteur. How Ego Holds You Back. When we talk about ego, we often imagine something loud and obvious, someone brimming with arrogance, self-importance, or entitlement. But more often, ego operates quietly, beneath the surface, shaping our thoughts, decisions, and emotional patterns in ways we barely notice. It doesn't always announce itself with grandiosity. Sometimes it whispers. It nudges us to avoid discomfort. It steers us toward safety. It tells us that protecting self-image is more important than discovering truth. And this is the form of ego that most profoundly holds us back. Not an outspoken braggart, but a subtle internal saboteur that biases thinking towards self-validation over self-growth. At its core, the ego thrives on a simple psychological trade-off. It will protect your sense of worth if you let it, even at the cost of real growth. When you prioritize feeling right over learning, when you choose safety over challenge, that is ego quietly making decisions on your behalf. This shows up most clearly in the way the ego drives us to seek validation rather than growth. We crave praise, admiration, and confirmation from others because it boosts our self-image. We crave certainty because ambiguity threatens the comfortable narrative we have built about ourselves. And when we encounter situations that might challenge our sense of adequacy, our ego works overtime to avoid the vulnerability that real learning demands. This need for external validation pushes us to cling to familiar comforts instead of embracing the discomfort inherent in growth. Perhaps the most common way this silent saboteur shows up is through avoidance of discomfort. True growth, whether psychological, emotional, or behavioral, demands that we confront what is uncomfortable. It requires risking failure, facing error, and acknowledging limitations rather than obscuring them. Yet our ego often convinces us that discomfort is a threat to our worth. We become afraid of failing because failure feels like an indictment of self-worth rather than a step in the learning process. We resist feedback because it challenges the tidy narrative we hold about our competence. We hide vulnerabilities because exposing them feels like weakness, when in truth, vulnerability is the gateway to connection and resilience. This avoidance reinforces patterns that feel familiar and safe, even if they prevent deep transformation and fulfillment. In psychology, there are well-documented behavioral patterns that illustrate this dynamic.
One such pattern is self-handicapping, where individuals unconsciously create obstacles or excuses that sabotage their own success in order to avoid the emotional risk of failure. People may procrastinate before a big task, indulge in behaviors that lower performance, or claim external barriers as reasons for potential failure, all to protect their self-esteem in case the outcome falls short. This cognitive strategy allows the ego to claim, "It wasn't my ability that failed, it was circumstance." In doing so, the ego bypasses accountability and avoids the discomfort of confronting genuine limitations or areas for growth. But this protection comes with a heavy cost. It undermines motivation, stagnates progress, and keeps us trapped in patterns we call normal, even though they are self-sabotaging. Another subtle force at play is known as the self-serving bias, the tendency to attribute success to internal strengths while blaming failures on external factors. This psychological phenomenon serves the ego well. It preserves self-esteem and shields the individual from painful self-reflection. If you succeed at work, your ego takes pride and affirms your worth. If you struggle or fail, the ego whispers that the conditions were unfair, that others didn't support you, or that circumstances were stacked against you. While this bias may feel protective in the moment, over time it prevents true learning and growth, because it stops you from asking the hard questions about how you could improve. The ego also drives patterns of comparison and competition that can be deeply limiting. When your ego measures your worth relative to others, it fosters envy, insecurity, and a need to outperform rather than a capacity to be curious, collaborative, or compassionate. This state of constant comparison doesn't celebrate individuality. It drains energy, undermines relationships, and distorts reality. You may interpret someone else's success as a threat, even though their growth does not diminish your own potential. The ego's focus on winning versus losing blurs what truly matters: collaborative learning, mutual support, and authentic contribution. Everyday life offers countless examples of ego in action, often slipping into the most unnoticed corners of our behavior. A professional who refuses to delegate because "no one can do it as well as I can" may appear confident, but beneath that belief often lies a fear of appearing replaceable or flawed, a fear rooted in ego's need for validation. Someone who insists on being right in an argument, even when it harms connection, chooses ego over relationship. Someone who defends every mistake, no matter how small, protects the ego's image at the expense of humility and growth. A spouse who avoids difficult conversations to prevent seeming weak sacrifices authenticity for short-term comfort. These are not isolated cases. They are patterns that feel normal precisely because the ego makes discomfort seem worse than stagnation itself. Ego doesn't always show up as arrogance or loudness. Sometimes it presents as quiet self-protection. It subtly tells you not to embrace feedback because it might hurt your pride. It nudges you away from risk because it might lead to failure. It encourages you to prove rather than improve. It convinces you that vulnerability is dangerous rather than essential. And all of this is in service of maintaining a mental script, a story that assures you of your worth in the face of the unknown. But this script can become a prison of comfort and fear, far removed from the deep learning and emotional maturity that shape fulfilled, connected, and meaningful lives. The silent saboteur's greatest trick is that it is not evil, it is that it feels familiar and reasonable. The mind argues that protecting self-image is rational. It claims that staying within known patterns keeps you safe. But what feels safe is often the very thing that ensures you never meet your fullest potential. True growth requires discomfort, reflection, accountability, and honesty, each of which feels threatening to the ego. The moment you confront a pattern that your ego cherishes, you feel fear, tension, or resistance. That's not a sign of danger, it is a sign of opportunity. It signals that a deeper layer of your potential is calling you forward. So as you listen to this chapter, I invite you to reflect not just with your mind, but with your experience. Notice the moments in your life when you chose comfort over challenge, safety over learning, or self-justification over accountability. These moments are not moral failures, they are data about where the ego has been leading you. Recognizing these patterns is not about blame, it is about awareness, the first step in dismantling the silent saboteur's grip and opening space for authentic growth, resilience, and human flourishing.
Chapter 4: How Ego Affects Your Life. When we think about ego, we sometimes imagine distant philosophical ideas or abstract psychological concepts. But the truth is that ego shapes how you experience everyday life, from how you see yourself to how you connect with others, make decisions, and even respond to discomfort. At its best, the ego helps you navigate reality by balancing internal needs with what the world demands. At its worst, when it becomes reactive or overly defensive, it interferes with self-awareness, our ability to look honestly at our thoughts, intentions, and emotions. This interference can subtly distort how we see ourselves and others, leading us to justify behavior that avoids introspection, keeps us defensive, and blurs the line between awareness and ego-based self-image. Ego's influence starts with the very lens through which you interpret your life. Instead of seeing yourself with clarity, ego filters your experience through a self-centered narrative that prioritizes your image and comfort over truth and growth. This means that when something threatens your self-image, whether it's a mistake, criticism, or discomfort, the ego's instinctive response is to protect itself rather than to understand what's really happening. This dynamic can make honest reflection feel risky because it feels like a threat to the identity the ego has worked so hard to preserve. When you're more concerned about looking good than being real, your ability to learn from experience shrinks, and your self-awareness becomes something you think you have rather than something you truly practice. This distortion becomes especially visible in relationships, the very places where vulnerability, empathy, and trust are needed most. An unchecked ego can prioritize pride over connection, causing you to defend your viewpoint rather than listen, to protect your image rather than admit fault, and to seek validation rather than understanding. When ego dictates your behavior, you may find yourself insisting on being right instead of being empathetic, or choosing blame over accountability. These patterns may feel justified in the moment, but they weaken your bonds with others. For example, defensiveness in a conversation may superficially protect your pride, but it also blocks empathy and deep listening, the very elements that build trust. Ego may make you feel justified, but it can also create emotional distance and subtle long-term resentment when connection is what your relationships actually need. Imagine an argument with a partner, friend, or colleague. Ego often whispers, "You need to prove you're right." But underneath those words is a deeper fear of appearing vulnerable, fallible, or imperfect. Instead of saying, "I made a mistake," the ego pushes you toward deflection, justification, or even blame. What feels like self-preservation in the moment can become a roadblock to connection, because genuine intimacy requires humility, curiosity, and the courage to be seen as you truly are, not as a defensive version of yourself. Ego's impact isn't limited to personal relationships. It spills into your professional life as well. In the workplace, ego can influence communication, decision-making, and leadership. When someone reacts defensively to feedback, resists new ideas, or feels threatened by others' success, it often stems from a deeper ego-based need to maintain superiority or self-worth. This doesn't just hurt collaboration, it inhibits learning, creativity, and adaptability. Research on cognitive biases shows how people tend to recall information that reinforces their own existing beliefs while overlooking evidence that contradicts them. This egocentric bias can solidify outdated thinking patterns and make change feel harder than it truly is. In everyday life,
The ego makes itself known in subtle but powerful ways. You might notice it when you stiffen at constructive criticism, or when you find yourself comparing your success to someone else's accomplishments, or when you react more strongly to a perceived slight than the situation warrants. These reactions, defensiveness, insecurity, ego-based comparison, aren't just fleeting emotional moments. They are patterns shaped by the ego's drive to protect a fragile sense of self. Over time, these patterns accumulate and create emotional distance, not only from others, but from your own true experience. What feels like self-confidence can sometimes be ego masking insecurity, and what feels like principle can sometimes be ego protecting image. There's a psychological concept known as the self-absorption paradox, which shows just how complex self-awareness can be. People can appear highly self-aware, confident, articulate, and reflective, yet still be driven by subtle ego-based narratives that distort their reality. This paradox highlights that simply being aware of ego isn't the same as transcending it. True self-awareness requires a deeper level of honesty about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do, not just recognition of ego's presence. So, as you listen to this chapter, consider this. Ego doesn't always announce itself with loud declarations or dramatic outbursts. More often, it shapes the quiet moments, how you react when someone disagrees with you, how you feel when you're praised or ignored, and how you interpret success or failure. These are the subtle terrains where ego exerts its influence on your life. And these are the places where genuine self-awareness must begin if you want to move beyond automatic ego-driven reactions towards a more authentic, open, and emotionally mature life.
Chapter 5. Recognizing Ego Patterns. One of the most important steps in moving beyond the automatic grip of ego is learning to recognize the patterns it uses to influence your thoughts, emotions, and reactions. These patterns aren't always loud or obvious. They often show up in the quiet moments, the inner whisper of, "I deserve this," or the instant irritation you feel before you can even name it. Ego creates a narrative in your mind, an internal story of who you think you are and how others should treat you. And these narratives influence your responses long before your logical mind has a chance to weigh in. Many of the ego's triggers are rooted in how it perceives its own worth and survival. One of the strongest triggers is criticism. When someone criticizes you, even with good intentions, your ego often interprets that as a threat to your self-image, as a challenge to the story you've built about yourself. In those moments, your initial reaction might be defensive, anxious, or dismissive, not because the criticism is inherently harmful, but because your ego sees it as a challenge to its carefully constructed identity. Another powerful trigger is comparison, the tendency to measure yourself against others so you can feel better or justified in feeling worse. When your mind tracks who has more, who's accomplishing more, or who deserves more, the ego is actively comparing its own value against external yardsticks, and that process can drive insecurity, anxiety, and subtle forms of self-judgment. Closely tied to criticism and comparison is the fear of not being enough. This fear of not being smart enough, successful enough, or worthy enough is not just a passing thought, it is a deep pattern that can subtly shape your decisions and reactions. When you feel that fear rising inside you, your ego isn't simply alerting you to a weakness, it's protecting a self-story that insists you must appear competent and valuable. In this way, ego doesn't help you grow. It defends the image of you as strong and capable, even if that image limits your willingness to be vulnerable, curious, or humble. Another way ego shows itself is through the automatic internal narratives that spring up before conscious reflection has a chance to speak. Perhaps you've caught yourself thinking something like, "They should know better," "I'm right," or "I deserve this." These thoughts often feel intuitive or justified, but what they reflect is not pure truth. They reflect a pattern of ego-based thinking
that seeks validation through certainty, justification, or entitlement. When you cling to being right, when you expect others to act according to your unseen standards, or when you demand that life unfold exactly as you imagine it should, the ego is steering your reaction, not your conscious self. What's especially important to notice is how the ego thrives on emotional reaction rather than thoughtful response. When something upsets you and your first pulse is irritation, defensiveness, or a sense of injury, that is the ego in action. It operates quickly because emotional reactions feel like threats or rewards to it. Strike a nerve, and the ego responds instantly, before reflection, before curiosity, and often before empathy has had a chance to prompt a more thoughtful reaction. Over time, this pattern risks turning your emotional reactions into default responses, ones that feel familiar and justified, but actually reinforce defensiveness and hinder genuine understanding. The key to recognizing these patterns and slowly loosening their influence is mindful self-witnessing, the practice of noticing your thoughts as they arise without being swept away by them. This doesn't mean you ignore your feelings or deny what you experience. It means you observe your internal reactions and narratives instead of being ruled by them. When you notice yourself thinking, "Everyone should treat me with respect," or "they must see it my way," you can start to question why that narrative arose. Is it serving genuine connection, or is it protecting an ego story about fairness, entitlement, or self-worth? When you catch these thoughts early, the moment they appear, not after they've driven your behavior, you cultivate self-awareness that is not the same as ego awareness, but reflection beyond ego's influence. This inward observation requires both honesty and compassion. As you become more familiar with your emotional triggers and internal narratives, you will likely notice that some thoughts don't serve your growth, even though they feel familiar. It's not about judging yourself for having these patterns. It's about revealing them to see them. When you watch your reactions rise and fall, the instinct to defend, to justify, to resist, you create a space between impulse and response. That space, as small as it might feel at first, is where true awareness begins. The awareness that notices ego without being dominated by it. The awareness that chooses thoughtful response over reactive emotion. Recognition of ego patterns is not a destination, it's a beginning. It's the moment when you stop simply acting out old habits and start seeing them as data about yourself, information you can use to guide real transformation. You will start asking yourself subtle yet powerful questions. Why did this thought rise so quickly? What was I defending? What fear was triggered? These questions do more than satisfy curiosity. They dismantle automatic ego responses and bring conscious understanding to what once felt inevitable. In this way, recognizing ego patterns paves the way for deeper emotional balance, clearer self-awareness, and more authentic engagement with life. Because once you see the pattern, you are no longer its prisoner, and your inner voice becomes a source of insight rather than automatic reaction. Chapter 6: Transcending Ego, Shifting Perspective. If ego has been shaping your reactions, decisions, and deeper emotional habits up to this point, it's not surprising that moving beyond its automatic hold can feel both liberating and intimidating. But the journey toward transcending ego, not eliminating it but softening its dominance, is one of the most profound and transformative paths you can walk. Transcending the ego doesn't require you to detach from the world or lose your sense of self. Rather, it invites you to observe that sense of self with clarity, to see its patterns without being ruled by them, and to gradually open space for growth, compassion, and purpose that extend beyond self-serving narratives. The first step in this process is self-awareness and observation of internal experience. True self-awareness isn't merely knowing what you like or dislike, or what your strengths and weaknesses are. It's about observing your thoughts, emotions, and mental responses as they arise before reacting to them. Psychological research shows that reflective thinking, when used constructively, strengthens your ability to regulate emotions and align actions with values rather than reflexive ego responses. This deeper kind of self-awareness allows you to see when the ego is speaking, not as your true voice, but as a conditioned mechanism defending self-identity. When you catch ego-driven thoughts as they surface, you begin to untangle who you are from what the ego wants you to believe you are. Closely tied to self-awareness is the cultivation of humility and curiosity, two essential allies in weakening ego's grip. Humility is not self-deprecation. It is the willingness to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, that growth often begins at the edge of discomfort, and that learning is a lifelong process. Curiosity keeps you open, open to new perspectives, open to feedback, and open to the possibility that your current beliefs, no matter how familiar, might not represent the full truth. When you learn to ask questions like, "What can I learn from this?" instead of, "How does this make me look?" you shift your attention from defending identity to expanding understanding. This is not about dissolving your ego completely. It is about integrating it with compassion, insight, and a deeper sense of purpose that extends both self and others. One of the most practical and effective tools for building this kind of awareness is daily reflection, journaling, or meditation, practices designed to strengthen what psychologists call witness consciousness, or the capacity to observe your mental processes without being overwhelmed by them. Journaling, for instance, is a form of reflective writing that helps externalize internal patterns, making them easier to see, understand, and transform. In therapeutic contexts, writing about thoughts and emotions has been shown to deepen emotional clarity and reduce automatic biases. When you consistently write about what you feel and why you feel it, you slow down the ego's rush to quick emotional reaction and create space for thoughtful reflection. Meditation serves a similar purpose by quieting the chatter of automatic thought and inviting you to observe your internal landscape with non-judgmental awareness. Through regular mindfulness practice, you learn to notice thoughts, including ego-driven ones, without clinging to them, resisting them, or identifying with them. This practice strengthens emotional regulation, reduces impulsivity, and gradually weakens the ego's dominance over your reactions. Neuroscience suggests that practices which reduce self-referential thinking can also quiet neural pathways associated with rigid ego structures, allowing for greater cognitive and emotional flexibility. It's also important to embrace the mindset that letting go of ego does not mean eliminating your identity. A healthy ego serves a purpose. It helps you operate in the world, make decisions, and interact with others. Transcending ego doesn't mean destroying that structural identity. It means rebalancing it toward presence and purpose so that your sense of self is grounded in awareness, compassion, and authentic choice rather than in validation, defensiveness, or fear of insecurity. As psychological research on the quiet ego highlights, developing a balanced ego, one that equally values self and others, supports both well-being and meaningful personal development. This means your self-concept becomes less about what you prove and more about how you engage with life and others meaningfully. Another practice that deepens this shift is active self-inquiry, the process of asking yourself probing questions about the origin of your thoughts, motivations, and fears. This kind of inward questioning, similar to the method recommended by traditions such as self-inquiry, invites you to explore who you are beyond the egoic I narrative, and to recognize that your core identity is not limited to transient thoughts, roles, or achievements. In many philosophical traditions, this inquiry is described not as ego destruction, but as liberation, revealing that the ego is a construct that can be observed, questioned, and ultimately integrated into a more expansive understanding of self. As you incorporate these practices, self-awareness, curiosity, reflection, meditation, and humility, you gradually create a life where the ego is no longer the default narrator dictating your sense of worth or steering your reactions. Instead, You begin to respond with intention, compassion, and clarity. You begin to see the ego's patterns as tools you can work with rather than automatic forces that control you. In this way, transcending ego becomes not a destination, but an ongoing dance of awareness, a lifelong process of observing, learning, adjusting, and integrating who you are with who you want to become. This is authenticity in action, and it opens space for purpose, connection, and a deeper sense of meaning that extends far beyond the ego's narrow confines.
Chapter 7. Living with Ego Wisely. When we imagine the ego, many of us picture something to be eliminated, a source of pride, defensiveness, or self-absorption that must disappear before we can grow. But in reality, ego is not a villain to be eradicated. It is a psychological pattern, a set of learned responses and identity narratives, not some separate entity that exists independently of your awareness. Understanding ego in this way, as part of the human psyche that mediates between inner impulses and external world, allows you to work with it rather than against it. In Freudian psychology, the ego is described as the rational, decision-making part of personality, the part that negotiates between instinctual drives, moral standards, and reality itself. It is not inherently bad, it is simply functional. Recognizing this allows you to integrate the ego into a larger sense of self, not as the master, but as a participant in a wiser, more conscious life. Living with ego wisely begins with awareness, the ability to observe internal patterns without blindly reacting to them. Awareness gives you the power to distinguish between automatic ego responses and thoughtful, intentional actions. When ego operates unexamined, it tends to default to defensive postures, self-protective thinking, and identity rigidity. But when ego is observed with awareness, its authority diminishes, and it becomes something you can work with, rather than something that controls you. Awareness isn't about eliminating ego entirely, that's neither possible nor desirable, but about reducing its automatic hold over your life. Better self-awareness helps you notice when your reactions are motivated by fear, insecurity, or self-image preservation, and when they are motivated by clarity, empathy, and purpose. One of the most powerful shifts in living with ego wisely is understanding that complete eradication isn't the goal. In psychology and spiritual traditions alike, ego reduction refers not to abandonment of self, but to the deflating of an overinflated sense of self-importance and self-centeredness, allowing a more balanced identity to emerge. Ego reduction has been recognized in various contexts, from clinical therapy to spiritual work, as a way to transcend rigid self-identification while still functioning effectively in the world. This process doesn't erase your individuality, it simply puts it in context so it no longer dominates your emotional and behavioral responses. If you want to live with ego wisely, you must learn to respond with intention rather than automatic reflex. Reactive identity, instinctive defensiveness, quick judgment, or self-justification tends to arise from ego's need to protect itself. But intentional awareness steps in before reflex takes over. Intentional response is like choosing to pause and ask yourself, is this reaction coming from fear, pride, or genuine understanding? That pause, even if only for a fraction of a second, opens the door to conscious action. In practice, this means observing your emotional landscape without immediately acting on it. Reflection, rather than impulse, becomes your guiding principle. Consider what it means to welcome feedback with an open mind. Ego-driven behavior hears feedback as a threat, a challenge to self-image, and responds with denial, defensiveness, or justification. But when you practice bringing awareness to the moment of feedback, your default changes. You might think to yourself, I hear this, what can I learn from it? That simple shift from defensive ego to curious learner
transforms your experience. In leadership circles, emotionally intelligent individuals are described as those who listen without judgment, invite diverse perspectives, and genuinely consider alternatives before forming a conclusion. This approach not only strengthens interpersonal relationships, but also fosters innovation, collaboration, and trust. Acknowledging mistakes is another hallmark of ego-aware behavior. When ego dominates, mistakes are often hidden, justified, or blamed on external factors. But when you cultivate a healthy relationship with ego, one grounded in awareness rather than self-protection, you can admit errors without shame or defensiveness. Saying something as simple as, "I made a mistake and I'm learning from it," signals humility, enhances credibility, and creates an environment where honesty and growth are possible. Leaders who practice this kind of vulnerability not only build trust, but also model psychological safety for others, encouraging a culture of learning rather than fear. Listening deeply is another powerful way to live with ego wisely. Ego often wants to respond, to prove itself, to be heard before it truly hears others. Ego listening interrupts, judges, and filters what is being said through its own inner narrative. But when you practice listening with intention, not to reply, but to understand, your ego steps back and awareness steps forward. This kind of listening allows you to connect with others on a deeper level because it values empathy over defense and understanding over winning. Living with ego wisely also means nurturing a balanced sense of identity that is neither inflated nor defensive, but responsive and resilient. Ego doesn't disappear when you become more aware, rather it loses its power over your unconscious patterns, allowing your deeper values and intentions to shape your actions. Awareness brings clarity to the provisional nature of identity, the idea that who you think you are is a dynamic narrative, not an unchangeable fixed self. Once ego begins to serve rather than dominate, you can engage with life more fully, with curiosity, humility, empathy, and presence. In the end, living with ego wisely is not about perfect behavior or constant self-monitoring. It's about creating a space within yourself where ego is neither ruler nor enemy, but partner. It's about recognizing ego's patterns without being controlled by them, choosing reflection over reaction, and acting from a place of conscious choice rather than automatic identity. This shift transforms ego from a barrier into a tool, one that can help you navigate relationships, work, challenges, and inner life with a deeper sense of balance, authenticity, and purpose.
Chapter 8. Your Path Forward. Freedom Beyond Ego. As we arrive at this final chapter of your journey through understanding ego, I invite you to reflect not only on what you've learned, but on how you've begun to see yourself differently. The ego we've explored throughout this audiobook is not some abstract enemy lurking in the shadows of your psyche. It's a psychological pattern, a learned set of responses and narratives that has shaped your decisions, your emotional reactions, and your sense of who you thought you were. In earlier chapters, you learned how the ego can quietly sabotage growth by skewing self-validation over self-awareness and turning survival instincts into habitual reactions. You saw how criticism, comparison, self-justification, and fear of vulnerability can all be manifestations of ego at work. And now, having witnessed these patterns with awareness, you are not powerless. You are empowered to transform how ego operates within your life. Reiterating the key takeaways isn't merely a summary of ideas. It's an invitation to internalize what is true and useful for your ongoing growth. Throughout this journey, you've seen that ego can sabotage growth when left unchecked. It prioritizes self-image over curiosity, defensiveness over reflection, and reaction over intention. But perhaps the most important truth you have encountered is that awareness empowers change. Awareness is the shift that moves you from being reactive to being responsive.
Instead of living in the fog of automatic egoic patterns, you now have the capacity to recognize them as they arise, to name them, and to choose a different path, a path guided by conscious intention rather than unconscious habit. It's also crucial to emphasize that progress is far more valuable than perfection. Transformation does not happen in a single moment or a single insight. It unfolds gradually, like a sunrise that begins subtly before spilling golden light over the horizon. Each time you catch yourself before reacting defensively, each moment you choose reflection over egoic assertion, each time you open your mind to another's perspective, these are acts of transformation. They may feel small, they may feel incremental, but they are real, and they compound over time. Transformation is experiential. It is lived, not merely understood, and it grows with each conscious step you take beyond habitual egoic patterns. As you consider your own path forward, I encourage you to look back on how far you've come. When this audiobook began, your awareness of ego may have been limited, a vague idea, an uncomfortable inner critic, or a recurring pattern you couldn't quite explain. Now you have language, insight, and reflection, tools that make what was once invisible now visible. This is not a journey toward perfection, it is a journey toward clarity. And with clarity comes freedom, freedom from reacting automatically, freedom from being defined by old narratives, and freedom to choose who you were becoming moment by moment. I also want to affirm that letting go of ego does not mean stripping away your sense of self, eliminating your identity, or denying your personal experiences. Rather, it means rebalancing identity toward presence and purpose. It means your sense of self becomes less about defending an image and more about being present with what is, embracing experience with openness, and living with intention rather than fear. You learn not to be controlled by the ebb and flow of reactive narratives, but to observe them without being ruled by them. This is what it means to cultivate a self that is both authentic and adaptive, a self that can celebrate accomplishments without needing them for validation, face setbacks without collapsing into insecurity, and engage with others without defensiveness. In this way, ego becomes less of a tyrant and more of an instrument serving your deeper purpose. In moving beyond ego's automatic dominance, you are not abandoning yourself, you are expanding your capacity to live more fully. Ego will still make itself known, it will still surface in unfamiliar moments or under stress, but now you can approach it with mindful awareness. You can notice its movements, understand its motivations, and respond with intention rather than react by default. This ability, to witness your own inner world without being swept away by it, is perhaps the greatest gift of all. It allows you to navigate life with both clarity and compassion, grounding your actions in conscious choice rather than unconscious reflex. So as this chapter and this audiobook draws to a close, let these final words be an encouragement for your ongoing life beyond these recordings. Carry this hope with you. Awareness is the turning point. Awareness gives you space, perspective, and freedom. Awareness invites intention where there was once reflex, and awareness nurtures the emergence of your true self, a self that is not defined by ego's limitations, but enhanced by presence, purpose, and possibility. And now, as you continue on your path forward, here is a hopeful affirmation to return to again and again. I am aware, not controlled by ego. I choose presence and purpose. Let these words be a reminder that your transformation is not a moment in time. It is a way of living, one conscious choice at a time. May your journey beyond ego not only be liberating, but rich with meaning, connection, and deep peace.